You know, night photography is hard because there are so many things that could go wrong, from blurry photos to noisy photos to flat looking photos. And in today's video, I want to share with you everything I know about night photography, from the best gear to the best settings to the best ways to read the light at night, and also to compositional techniques to use specifically at night. And make sure to stick till the end for my bonus tip when I'm going to show you why I shoot all my photos at night and during the day at a white balance of 5600 Kelvin. Without further ado, I would say, let's get started. So let's get gear out of the way first. And there is two factors that contribute to better image quality at night. The first one is sensor size, and generally speaking, the bigger the sensor, the better the image quality. But that's only one part of the story, because the other and arguably much more important part of the story is the lens that you put in front of your camera. And for night photography, I typically recommend fixed focal lengths, or prime lenses, because they usually let in more light than zoom lenses of the same price category. They also are usually much more compact, and these days super high quality without breaking the bank. And if you shoot on full frame, I recommend a prime of f2.8 or a brighter f-stop. And if you shoot on APS-C, I recommend a prime of f2 or brighter. But gear aside, the photos that you can see here are actually taken on a kit lens, so don't make your gear an excuse for not going out and shoot at night. And while I would argue that gear certainly matters for low light photography, there is one aspect that matters arguably so much more, which is the best low light photography settings. So let's first talk about aperture, and this one is actually super easy because you just shoot at the lowest f number that your lens goes to. So if your lens has a maximum opening of f2.8, set it to f2.8. If your lens goes to f2, set it to f2, or if your lens even goes to f1.4 or even f1.2, set it to f1.4, f1.2. Okay, I would argue that aperture is reasonably straightforward because you just shoot at the lowest f number that your lens goes to, but the real tricky part comes now, which is shutter speed. And the thing is that if your shutter speed is too fast, your camera is exposed to light only for a very brief moment, not able to capture enough light for an accurate exposure, and the camera compensates by raising the ISO, which we want to avoid. On the other hand, if you shoot at a super slow shutter speed, everything that's moving in your frame while you take the photo will be blurry. And this can make for a nice effect and be very intentional, like here for instance, but most of the time we want to freeze the action. So the real question we need to answer here is, what is the optimal shutter speed that is not too fast, so letting in enough light to get clean results, but also not too slow to prevent our subject from blurring when moving? And in fact, there is many variables to consider when trying to assess this optimal shutter speed, like for instance your focal length, also the speed of your subject moving, the distance of your subject from the camera. But my general rule of thumb is that I shoot at a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second if I want to freeze the action, because it has just proven to be the perfect sweet spot for me. And sometimes I do diverge from this 1/100th rule of thumb, such as for instance my subject being super small in the frame and motion of them moving is less apparent. Then I drop my shutter speed even to as low as 1/60th or even 1/30th of a second. And if my subject is moving super quickly and is close to the camera, I also occasionally tune it a bit higher to even 1/160th of a second. But if I deliberately want blur in my photos, like these long exposure shots here, I go much slower, like 1/15th of a second, 1/4 of a second, or all the way up to multiple seconds. But in this case, the limit will really become your hand-holding capabilities. You might need a tripod when you expose for a second or even longer. Okay, so now we have maximized the light gathering of our lens, and we have optimized our shutter speed to be the best trade-off. So now let's finally talk about the least important component, which is ISO, and this one is luckily easy again. Because in fact, I just set ISO to auto, letting the camera freely choose between the base ISO of the camera all the way up to ISO 12800 without really limiting it, because sometimes you really just shoot in very dark environments and you just have to raise your ISO beyond ISO 6400. But there is one important catch here, because we have manually set our aperture, we have manually set our shutter speed, and we have set the ISO to auto. But now there is sadly one problem, which is that since we've given up control over ISO to the camera, how does the camera even know what the real ISO is supposed to be? And that's the thing the camera does not know, because it is wired to expose photos in a very particular way that simply doesn't work very well for low light photography. And to account for this bias, camera manufacturers have invented exposure compensation. And at night, your exposure will always be too bright at 0 EV, so at what the camera thinks is the proper exposure, and you use exposure compensation to bring down the exposure for the exposure to match what you've seen with your real eyes. And generally speaking, the darker the scene, the more I reduce the exposure using exposure compensation. So for a regular night shot, I usually underexpose by -1 stop, which has a few advantages I'm not going to go into in this video. But if it gets increasingly darker, I actually sometimes dial it even to -2 stops. So depending on what the scene looks like, I usually underexpose by -1 stop or even all the way to -2 stops. And now you might have chosen the best gear. You might have optimized your settings to work perfectly, and yet your photos might still look noisy and flat. And that's exactly where the topic of light comes in. Because yes, if you shoot in plain darkness, there is not enough light that the sensor can capture, and your photos will look flat because there is no contrast between darkness and brightness. So in other words, we need to find high quality light sources that are bright, but we also need to find interesting light sources to create an obviously more interesting photo. And my favorite light sources are shop windows, street lanterns, tube entries, and neon lights. But of course, now the question arises, how do we actually use these lights to our advantage? And this is exactly where backlighting, side lighting, and front lighting come in. And then finally, we have overhead lighting. So let's get through them one by one. So first of all, we have backlighting. So you make sure that the bright light source is coming from behind your subject. So if your light source is, for instance, a shop window, just place yourself on the opposite side of the shop window and wait until somebody walks through. If your main backlighting source is, for instance, a car, make sure that there is a person, for instance, crossing the street, and you snap the photo when they are in front of the car, and this will make for very interesting shots. Similarly, you can also use side lighting, so just reveal one part of the face of your subject by, for instance, placing your subject at a 90-degree angle from the shop window. And then finally, we have overhead lighting, which is light that comes from right above your head, like for instance from a street lantern pointing down. And while it is not necessarily the most flattering for portraits, it can really enhance the mystery of your photo, and I actually love overhead lighting in night photography. And then finally, let's talk briefly about composition at night. And here is my 3 favorite low light composition techniques. The first one is layering. I allocate my scene in a way that I have a foreground, I have a midground, and I have a background for more intention to my photo and also increased complexity. And then the next one, and this one is my absolute favorite, supporting subjects. And this one implies that I usually have one main subject that I balance in my scene with a supporting subject. So another subject in your frame that's giving your photo enhanced sophistication and context. And then the final technique is leading lines. Find strong lines that lead to your subject, such as railings or sidewalks, but the shadows of my subjects, when they are backlit, can actually also be very handy as a leading line, as they automatically point to your subject. And you can obviously also combine these techniques. For instance, you can have multiple layers that also include a main subject and a supporting subject, and possibly a leading line that guides the viewer's attention to one of your subjects. And finally, now let's get to the bonus tip of today's video, which is white balance. And in fact, I always manually set my white balance to 5600 Kelvin. Why? And in fact, during the day, you may find reasonably neutral colors, and the camera usually makes a relatively good job at guessing the correct white balance for the scene. At night, however, the light sources and their color are all over the place. You have such a huge diversity from very warm colors to very cold colors, and the camera just gets very easily confused as to what is the correct white balance for the scene. So in practice, that means that auto white balance can at times be insanely inconsistent, making your photo either too cold or too warm. So in order to have a consistent white balance, I always choose 5600 Kelvin. If we now have a look where exactly 5600 Kelvin sits on the Kelvin scale, you can see that it's basically exactly in the middle between warm tones and cold tones, giving us a nice compromise. So in other words, at night, I find a nice balance where cool lights stay cool while warm lights stay warm. And this is exactly why I use 5600 Kelvin for all of my photos at night and during the day. And while I have not dedicated a video on white balance specifically yet, I did very well cover the topic as to why the camera is so terrible at properly exposing files in low light, but also during the day. And I highly invite you to check out this video right here. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today. And I hopefully see you in the next video. Bye.